Well, good morning. Glad you're here today. If you're visiting with us, we offer you a special welcome. Glad to see you today. We are in the second week of this series called Heroes, and we're looking at some lesser-known heroes in the Bible, specifically some of the female heroes of the Bible. We started last week with Sarah and Abraham, if you remember, and Abraham is kind of known as the father of the Jewish people, which makes Sarah the mother of the Jewish people, but you don't really hear about that as much. But we looked at the good and the bad in Sarah and Abraham as well. Now, like I said, generally speaking, when we talk about superheroes, we think of people that have extraordinary abilities. They can do stuff that we can't do. But beyond that, what makes them heroes and not villains is that they do the right thing for the right reasons. Right? They have this courage and this integrity to do what is right when it counts. And that's where we take a look at heroes. I don't know about you, what makes it hard to identify with heroes, however, like at least superheroes for us, is that we don't always have the powers that they do. Maybe you do, I don't know. But I know I don't have any superpowers. So it's kind of hard to relate sometimes, like to Superman, who can fly anywhere he wants, whenever he wants, when you're stuck on an airplane trying to fight for that middle armrest thing, right? It's hard to identify with Wonder Woman and her golden lasso of truth when your kids won't tell you who stole the last cookie, right? That kind of stuff. So we're going to look at now heroes, but they're real people, right from the Bible, who are like us, that have real problems, real struggles, who are ordinary, but live in extraordinary circumstances, and how we can learn from their mistakes and their great moments and their successes. So for our second hero, we're going to stay in the Old Testament and look at the book of Judges. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible because it's got some awesome, fun stories in it. When you see the name Judges, you typically think of someone like, Judge Judy behind a bench with a long black robe. That's not what's going on in this book of the Bible. These judges are more national leaders. Yes, they decide cases, but they're more of almost like warrior heroes, warrior judges who, more like Judge Dredd, is I guess the way you kind of look at something like this. Okay, that's who these people were. And the book of Judges is set in a time of oppression, but then also great success. And it has these kind of ups and downs in the flow to it. There are times when the people are really faithful and they're doing great, and then times when they don't do so well and they get oppressed by someone. And generations come and go over the years in the book of Judges. And you've got some great heroes, like Samson in the book of Judges, who's kind of the Incredible Hulk of the Old Testament. You've got Gideon, kind of the Tony Stark wise guy in the book of Judges. But today we're not going to look in this set of stories at the judges themselves, the national leaders, the halls of power. We're going to look at someone who lived during this period, all right, but part of a family. Again, more ordinary, more like you and I. A practical story and a personal family story. And the story's told by what I consider to be a great storyteller. Remember this, back in the summer we did the Gospel of Matthew all the way through, and we looked at how great of a storyteller Matthew was. Well, the author of this book is kind of the same thing. He likes to use names and places to bring meaning. Well, it starts off in a town called Bethlehem. Sound familiar? A little town somewhere? Okay. So in Bethlehem it starts off, and in Bethlehem at this period there's a big famine in Israel. And so a family who lives in Bethlehem here is going to move over here to Moab, which is kind of modern day Jordan today. And like I said, what this book is going to do is give us some Easter eggs. You know what Easter egg is? Not the egg at Easter time, but like in a movie, in any like superhero fan movie, people, like a lot of times the directors will leave Easter eggs in the movie for the comic book fans. Some little thing like, I saw that little thing in the corner of the screen which meant whatever. Well, in some ways, this author is going to do the same thing throughout this story to give us little hints about how the story is going to move along. One of the first ones is how he uses names, all right? So, the first person named is the husband, the father, and his name is Elimelech, okay? And that name literally means, my God is king. Okay, so this super faithful guy, Elimelech, which means my God is king. And he has a wife whose name is Naomi, which means pleasant. So, two people, my God is king and his wife, pleasant, are going to take their kids and move to Moab. Well, they have two kids. The first named is Machlan. It sounds like Klingon, doesn't it? But it's Hebrew. And the other sounds like Chilion. And these two kids, their names mean, you ready for this? Sickness and dying. I don't know where those fit in the baby naming book. You know, like, look, here's one. Let's call the kid sickness. I don't know. I mean, and how do you introduce them? Here's my two kids. This is valley fever and walking pneumonia. Nice to meet you. But that's kind of a strange little family. Well, they go and they move to Moab. And when they get there, they kind of settle in, okay? And the two kids, again, sickness and dying, get married to two Moabite women. And that's a problem for Jewish folks, okay? Because God said, don't intermarry with the people around you. And sure enough, they did. And in fact, the Moabites down here were enemies of the Jewish people when, under the Exodus with Moses, they kind of came up through here from Moab to Ammon, and they came in this way through Jericho. They had some battles in here with these people. So they were kind of the enemies of the Jewish people. And here, sickness and dying marry to Ruth and Orpah. It's not Oprah, it's Orpah. And you're probably wondering, well, what do their names mean? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. So, they lived there for 10 years, a decade. And things don't go so well for this little family because the dad, Elimelech, he dies. And then the two kids, the two boys, sickness and dying, they die, which is probably no surprise. So now you've got Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi widowed. And in this period, that's a very, very difficult time. If you're widowed and no family around, you kind of lose all of your support. It's not just like a personal, emotional tragedy, it's an economic tragedy too. Because now Naomi's in a foreign country, no family around, with two daughters-in-law, and no means of support. In fact, in Israel, there were commands given in the Old Testament to take care of folks in that situation. God has a real heart for orphans and for widows. It was part of Israel's DNA built into their law code. Isaiah 58 is a chapter from the prophet Isaiah, and he talks about this. In Isaiah 58:2, God says this, "Day after day, they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask me for righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God." And the prophet's saying, you talk a great game. You want to be close to God. You want to play the role. And you say to God, God, don't you see us when we fast? Don't you hear our awesome prayers? Don't you see our bumper stickers that say WWJD on them? Don't you see that cool stuff and how much we care? And then the prophet goes on. Is this not the fast or worship that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them? And God's saying, look, all that other stuff, that's not worship. What I'm looking for from you is to take care of people, specifically the orphan and the widow, which is why I'm so excited that we do Family Promise over and over again. Makes a difference. And that Kim and her team take care of Foster Arizona. This is exactly the kind of stuff that God's about. Taking care of the widow and the orphan, the homeless poor. He said, that's worship. Do that stuff first, is what he's saying. Isaiah 1:17, the first chapter of Isaiah. He says, learn to do good. Seek justice. Rescue the oppressed defend the orphan, plead for the widow. It's part of God's people's DNA. And that's true for the Christians as well. It continues on, of course, into the New Testament. James chapter 1, he says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. So he's like, this is it. Like, this is like the summary of what it means to be a faithful follower of Christ. To care for the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Faithfulness is kind of defined by how we treat other people, right? When we love others, when we show love to other people, we're showing our love for God. It's demonstrated, and it's heroic. Okay, so back to our story. Now you've got 3 widows in their distress. And Naomi hears that the famine is over back in Bethlehem. Well, she has family in Bethlehem, so the best thing for her to do is to go back to Bethlehem, where her family is. There's some support there. But for Ruth and Orpah, what are they going to do? Where's their family? In Moab. They're not going to want to go back to Bethlehem, where they probably can't get married because they're not supposed to get married to people living in that area. So, what happens? Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. And at first, Orpah and Ruth kind of start going with her. But Naomi kind of says, no, look, you ladies need to stay here. Right? This is where your support is. You need to stay with your families where you have some support and some help. And kind of wants them to do the best thing for them. Orpah kind of goes a little bit, then decides to go back, to stay in Moab. And in fact, her name, Orpah, means back of the neck. Because that's what she does. She said, okay, well, I'm just going to stay home. And so she turns around, goes back home, and shows Naomi the back of her neck, so to speak. When the going gets tough, Orpah gets going. And even Naomi knows it's the right move for her. Ruth, however, has a different meaning to her name. Her name means friend. Friend. And she insists on going with Naomi. That's what friends do. Not Facebook friends, friends, real friends. And we get this really beautiful passage in the first chapter, the very first chapter of Ruth. Ruth 1:16. But Ruth said, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I'll be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Beautiful passage, right? How many of you have heard that read at a wedding? Yeah, quite a few, like seriously, like where you go, I'll go, and where you die. It's this kind of beautiful little, Stacy's laughing at me like, it's this beautiful little passage about marriage. But here's the reality, folks. I believe in the Bible, right? And you do things biblically at a wedding. So, if you're going to use this passage in a wedding, what you need to do is you have the bride-to-be turn to the mother-in-law and say, where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Okay. Just kidding. You don't do that. But that's kind of what this is going on here, right? I mean, the daughter-in-law is saying to the mother-in-law, I'm with you. I'm not going anyplace. So this is what friendship kind of looks like. Here, a woman, an outsider, a Moabite, decides to stay with her mother-in-law for the sake of her mother-in-law. This is going to put Ruth in a worse situation, right? Ruth is going back to a country where she's considered an enemy, where no one's going to want to marry her necessarily. And she's leaving her security in her home and her family to take care of Naomi. So you begin to see that friendship and faithfulness kind of go hand in hand. A friendship is a relationship that you can count on. It's not what you get from a friendship, what you give to the friendship. And Ruth has committed herself to Naomi as a friend. So together they go back to Bethlehem, which is a small town in these days. About 200 people live in Bethlehem at this time, give or take. And Naomi is still pretty sad about everything that's gone on. And she decides that she's going to change her name from Naomi, meaning pleasant, to Mara, meaning bitter. She sees the death of her husband and her 2 sons as punishment from God and begins to define her life by that and becomes bitter. There's a book called A Grace Disguised, and the author, Gerald Sitzer, tells a story about his family where one night in Idaho, he loses his mom, his wife, and his youngest daughter in a car crash, all in the same night. It was just dark time, obviously, for him. He said, "My story is part of a larger story that I did not choose. I was assigned a role for which I did not audition." It's like, this happened. Like, there's nothing I can do about it. This is now part of who I am. It's part of my story. But the question that he begins to ask is that going to define me? Am I going to become Mara, bitter, or am I going to have a different reaction to this story? How am I going to respond? I mean, that's what our story is, right? Our story is our response to this kind of stuff in our life. We are the storytellers of our story. How do you tell your story when things like this happen? Mara, bitterness, or pleasantness. How you can tell the story. Sitzer goes on and he says, "I have this sense that the story God has begun to write, he will finish. That story will be good. The accident remains now, and always has been, a horrible experience that did great damage to us and to so many others. It was and will remain a very bad chapter. But the whole of my life is becoming what appears to be a very good book." So how do you see those moments? And you see Naomi becoming Mara, bitter by the situation. But there's a larger story here. A larger story for Naomi and for Ruth, for Sitzer, and for you and me. So now we move our story to Bethlehem. And Mara and Ruth are there, and they're poor. They have no help, it seems, even in Bethlehem. And so Ruth goes out and begins to glean in a field. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the Old Testament, there was this way that God was given to the people to take care of the poor and the hungry. And what he said was, you're going to go out and you're going to leave parts of your field open. If you drop something, you're going to leave it so the poor can come behind and pick it up. Deuteronomy 24, God said this to his people. "When you reap your harvest in your fields and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it." It's a command, not an option. You will not go back and get it. "It should be left for the alien, the orphan, the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings." And he said, even to leave the corners of your field, the edges, leave those too. And the idea was that people in need could go and work to get that food. Right? There's dignity in work. There's dignity in work. And so he says, you leave this, they go out and they can kind of earn some food for themselves. But you leave it, you drop it, you leave it, and you leave the corners of your field there. And Ruth does just that. She goes out into a field and begins to glean. And it says that she works hard at it. She works super hard at it. She's passionate, even about what she's doing here. She's not looking down on it. She's like, I'm going to work hard and take care of Naomi and take care of myself, and we're going to do this. You know, often I feel that how you approach your work is more important than the work you do. Right? I think how we approach our jobs, whatever they are, how you do that is often more important than what you do itself. How do you approach your work? How do you approach your Monday? Well, Ruth is excited about that, and she's in this field gleaning, and no coincidence, by the way, she's in the field of a man named Boaz. And his name means, in him is strength. And she's working super hard. And the other reapers, the people that are reaping the fields, not the Grim Reaper, but the reapers, are seeing her working super hard and sweating and working hard. So they begin to drop some extra food for her, right? Because they see the effort she's putting in. And they tell Boaz about her. And Boaz goes back and says, okay, guys, this is what I want you to do. I want you to drop even more grain for her. She's working hard. Let's help her out a little bit. Let her come and she'll eat with us and she'll have some water with us. We're kind of going to take care of her, right? In fact, he says to her, look, don't go anyplace else. Stay in my fields. We're going to watch out for you. Nothing bad's going to happen to you while you're with us. So he's this really honorable guy, right? Because a lot of people, it seems, in these days weren't doing the whole gleaning thing. They weren't leaving anything. They were breaking this commandment. And yet, here's Boaz, keeping the commandment, leaving food for people to pick up, and when they do, he helps them as well. I mean, truly, in him is strength. So when Ruth gets home one night, she tells Naomi, or Mara, about Boaz. And Naomi's like, I know that guy. He's part of our family. I mean, he's part of who we are. Tell you what you need to do. I want you to go back, get her all dressed up, right? And she sends her back to Boaz, where he's sleeping on the threshing floor, watching over the grain, and sends her back with a marriage proposal. I know that's quick, probably the fastest marriage proposal in history, but she goes back and she proposes basically to Boaz. And Boaz accepts. He's going to marry Ruth. But Ruth then says to him, and by the way, marrying me, I want you to redeem my family, including Mara, my mother-in-law. Which, redeeming a family was part of God's commands, part of how God kept families together and kept the poor taken care of and the outsiders and the orphans. But while you got the family's property and stuff like that, you also inherited all the debt. You inherited the poor. You inherited the children, which got a share of the inheritance. So for a lot of folks, it's like, there's a lot of burden that goes on with taking care of the orphan. There's a lot of financial burden that takes part of being redeemed or redeeming someone into the family. And so a lot of folks, they just didn't do it. But Boaz says, yeah, I'm going to do that because it's the right thing to do. Financially, probably not. But morally, in God's economy, it's the right thing to do, to take care of the orphan and the widow. So he's going to go to the city gate to make this proposal to redeem the family, which is kind of like City Hall in those days, all right? But there's one family member, like ahead of Boaz on the org chart, right? There's one other person who could redeem the family ahead of Boaz. There's one person out there that could keep Boaz ruthless. You knew that was coming, right? Like, I had to work it in somewhere. All right. So he goes to this guy and he says, hey man, here's Ruth, right? And here's the deal, and you can redeem the family. And the guy's like, yeah, sweet, more land for me. And then Boaz goes, yeah, but hold on a second. There's the land and all that, but you also get, Ruth, who's Moabite and foreign, and, her husband died. And then also, oh yeah, I forgot, there's this mother-in-law, and she calls herself bitter, but I'm sure you'll love her. She's great, right? And the guy's like, no thanks, you can have that. And Boaz then does redeem Ruth and Naomi and the family. And all of this happens because Ruth starts off by being a friend to her mother-in-law. Now, you also have to ask one more question. Why would Boaz do this? Why Boaz? He's a good guy. He is strong, right? In him is strength. He follows God's commands. He goes above and beyond. He takes care of the widow and the orphan. Why? Well, I kind of looked into that a little bit, and I got maybe an answer for you. If you go to the New Testament, in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, it says, and Solomon was the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. So you have Ruth here and Boaz here. But who's Boaz's mom? Rahab, right? And very few women are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. This is one of them. Here's another one. But Rahab. You know who Rahab was? The prostitute of Jericho, right? So she was a bit of an outsider. So Boaz's mom was the prostitute of Jericho. So do you think he knows a little what it's like to be an outsider? Probably, right? And that shapes him, I think. That he knows what it's like to be vulnerable, to be in need, potentially. And so here's a person in his strength, honors God, keeps his commandments, takes care of the most vulnerable, and takes care of those in need, and shows great compassion. And so yes, in him is strength. And of course, Ruth and Boaz have kids. Their great-great-grandson is King David, an ancestor of Jesus. And if you ever wondered why at Christmas time did Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem, oh little town? Because of Ruth and Boaz. Because they are the first redeemers in this story. Boaz redeems Ruth, and their child, or their distant relative, Jesus, redeems the world. John 14, Jesus says, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may also be." He buys us back from sin, death, and separation, and redeems us as part of his family. So we have a story now of a woman who shows friendship to her mother-in-law and redeems her. We have a story of a man, Boaz, who commits himself to God and doing what the right thing, doing what God wants, worshiping the way God wants us to worship, and redeems a family. And then we have a Christmas story of a child who grows up and redeems the world. In fact, Jesus' name in Hebrew is Yeshua. And guess what it means? To deliver, to save. So this is a story about redemption, our story of redemption. How can we go out and deliver and rescue and redeem those around us? Because that's what we're called to do, to be redeemers, to see lives that are in need of hope and help, and to show them strength and compassion and kindness, and ultimately to point them to redemption. Let's pray.